Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to participate this evening and for this opportunity to talk about San Lorenzo. It's always a privilege to talk about it, and especially in the context of this wonderful new publication by Anne and Vicki. None of this is possible without decades of research and dozens of people who participate in the project. So while I'm here to talk to you a little bit about San Lorenzo and the little bit of work that I contributed to the work over the last 2.5 decades, this is really a celebration of Vicki and Anne's new book, which takes all of 25 years of research and really brings it to the foreground. In particular, I played a small role in this work, but was able to work with Professor Cyphers on an important project that we conducted over 15 years ago at the site that we've called the San Lorenzo Geospatial Project. For the past 15, 16 years, we keep applying a series of nested geospatial techniques to better understand the development and evolution of the Olmec city of San Lorenzo, the surrounding regional landscape built on a foundation of more than 2 decades of prior archaeological research, excavation, settlement survey, and artifact analysis. This project expands the coverage and confirms much of what is known about San Lorenzo's evolution and settlement ecology. It also provided an opportunity to re-examine the spatial and temporal patterns of architecture and artifacts as it relates to San Lorenzo's cultural history. Here, I just wanted to review what we did with the Digital Subsurface Survey, a project wherein the entire site, as shown here, was gridded, referenced, and cored for soil. We illustrate how we're applying design tools to better interpret the data collected some 14 years ago, and then briefly talk about how remote sensing, including LiDAR and low aerial high-resolution imagery, can be applied to broaden the interpretations of San Lorenzo. Together, these technologies provide a small foundation for the incredible work that has recently been published by Vicki and Anne, which offers a far more useful and informative history when coupled to decades of the traditional archaeological research that Professor Cyphers has conducted at the site. So to quickly overview what I'll talk about today, I will simply introduce the project, talk about the soil coring program, the analysis and modeling, and introduce some of the interesting models that we've started to work with thanks to these data. But in particular, it really provides a basis to talk about this wonderful soil coring program, the analysis and modeling, and the exhibition of the design tools. The mapping data that started this project began in 2002. But it invited us to think about new ways of looking at San Lorenzo, especially in the context of rapidly evolving geospatial technologies some 20 years ago. It starts, though, even earlier. We simply mapped something that was already very well mapped and studied. Over 6 decades of archaeological research have been carried out at the Olmec capital of San Lorenzo. Sterling in 1955, Coe and Deal in 1980. And all of this yielded valuable information on the city's development from the lower pre-classic until the end of the terminal classic period. But it was Anne's work of the PASLT over the last 2 decades that has shifted the archaeological research at San Lorenzo from prospection and documentation to serious anthropological inquiry, emphasizing the organization and evolution of this very complex archaeological site. All of this is discussed at length in this new publication. Coupled to this shifting approach has been an equally innovative approach to sampling and testing at San Lorenzo. So it's both contributing to our understanding of the prehistory of the Olmec, but also to methodological advancements in archaeology. With funding from CONACYT between 2005 and 2007, we conducted surveys across the site of San Lorenzo. 2,602 soil samples were extracted, studied, and analyzed by dozens of students, collaborators, and colleagues. San Lorenzo is an incredibly challenging site from an archaeological perspective, especially when it's compared to highland counterparts and even the lowland Maya. The site, situated adjacent to the Coatzacoalcos River, sits on a natural plateau with nearly 4,000 years of human modification, design, planning, construction, and use. These transformations are coupled to substantial environmental processes of erosion and landscape change. Visible today is a cumulative coupled natural and and historical deposit with deep and complex stratification, multiple occupation components, and architectural remains completely made of earth. Such archaeological complexity, no doubt, requires innovative and transformative methods. Our work is sometimes costly in time and resources, and the spatial extent of data that can be obtained during the short dry season of 3 months is very limited. Anne's experience led to the recognition of these limitations and their implications for obtaining a transformative set of information that could understand the occupational and construction history of the site and its internal organization more fully. With this in mind, we aim to think and link the above-ground survey to the below-ground samples. First, we theoretically divided the site, shown in blue and red, into 2 areas, the central area and the periphery. The overall sampling strategy initially involved testing at intervals of 20 meters. These were designed to be enhanced by limited excavations of a set of high-resolution samples at 5-meter intervals, which was the purpose was to expand the information without further damage to the site. Other archaeologists had implemented and tried sampling distributions regionally, but this was the most extensive and intensive sampling strategy designed. Over 3 field seasons, 2,602 samples were uniformly extracted from the site. A video, which is available on the prior publication by Professor Cyphers and colleagues, was produced in the first year to be sure that new students and field participants would carry out sampling using the very same techniques. All soils were extracted, stratigraphic samples were laid out on tarps as shown here and recorded according to color, characteristics, and inclusions. Each layer was photographed along with systematic observations of characteristics, including the amount of organic matter, texture, plasticity, inclusions, humidity, internal drainage, and color. From a fieldwork perspective, there were several key challenges for implementation of this strategy. Sometimes we hit groundwater. Occlusions or impediments to sampling, such as impenetrable rocks or artifacts, required us to move samples 20 to 30 centimeters apart. Sometimes the insertion and removal of equipment at greater depths, greater than 5 meters, was a substantial challenge, as shown here in the photos. It was a combined creative process where teamwork ruled the day. Each of the team members adapted daily to field work, either by crafting new tools to retrieve and balance the soil coring tools, or by students who waited at night, every night, to provide sufficient time to type in the daily field observations. Suffice it to say, the laboratory work will be continuing for the next decade. But the initial GIS interpretation and processing is incredibly well exhibited in this new publication. All of these discrete observations of soil color, floors, shown here in these images, are now available through this new publication by Anne and Vicki. As mentioned previously, 2,602 samples were extracted over 3 years. The samples were first gridded according to the Ejido land patterns shown here. And despite the challenges associated with such a research plan, several samples were used to compare to known deposits for verification, which is kind of shown here from left to right. So simply the excavations of the past 25 years were linked to the 2,602 observations that were extracted between 2005 and 2007. So shown here is a stratigraphic cut where you have 2 samples about 5 meters apart, which could be linked up through their stratigraphy. Another one on the far right shows correlation that exists for both strata and occupational surfaces between excavations and soil sampling. Beginning with the survey and integrating the soil data, now along with LiDAR data and new observations, we're beginning to build a 4-dimensional model of the site and region. That is the primary basis for the wonderful book that Vicki and Anne have produced here. From its original form over the course of almost 4 millennia until today, the purpose of the models we're developing are to not only describe the evolution of this important Olmec capital, but it's also to demonstrate the important cultural and natural archive that the site represents regionally, nationally, and globally. It's also an effort to decouple 4,000 years of natural and human complexities of site formation. Simply, the site is impressive in its inherent complexity. And while this is abundantly clear when you visit and work at the site, it is very difficult to communicate to someone that has never visited San Lorenzo. The testing program verified many of the long-standing observations about the site size and distribution of the site. From the transects, it was clear that the site covered more than 700 hectares. The periphery of the site evidenced more dispersed activities, lower intensity of artifacts, and perhaps lower densities of population, as Vicky and Ann discuss. But also confirmed is this really complex and beautiful layered evolutionary history of the site. While it was known before the project that the site was largely artificial, the volume of change was underestimated. Right now, we can safely articulate at least 5 key periods of the site change and quantify the volumetric dimensions of change. Shown on the far left, the natural landform is an irregularly shaped island covering an area estimated to be about 125 to 150 hectares. Filling and leveling of pre-San Lorenzo did little to increase the size and height of the plateau, but was really focused on defining areas of habitation and related activities, where you see the low fill. During the San Lorenzo phase, the site evolves into a major regional center, and the evolution of the plateau evidences this transformation. We don't have specific details on early monumental architecture form, as it is found in other settings, but it's fairly clear from the volume of effort that the plateau as a whole exhibits the size commonly attributed to monumental architecture, especially the expansion of terraces. The San Lorenzo B period is marked by additional construction on the plateau and expansion of the terraces. Post-classic and modern transformations left a lasting mark on the site, including the removal of past deposits as fill for post-classic construction. And what is visible today but are a fraction of the substantial transformations that occurred during the San Lorenzo phase. Shown here is a beautiful figure from Vicky and Ann's new book that clearly demonstrates the origin of the site all the way up through the modern complexity of the topography that can be seen today. In this database is not just topography, going from the modern surface all the way back through time. But we also can see the site evolving through the identification of floors and features, which is really well described and articulated throughout this new publication. In the early site, there are really 3 time periods we can look at. In the 1600 BC, floors were identified in 52 sample locations, largely concentrated to the south and east of the site. Coupled to the floors, there appears to be broad open areas of open space in the central portions of the site. At 1400 BC, floors are more broadly distributed throughout the site. There are 72 identified floors, and a pattern of potential elite agglomeration of space as interpreted by the high presence of high status floors on the western edge of the site. The central open area is a fraction of its previous size. Around 1200 BC, shown on the far right, 212 floors were identified with a further compartmentalization of space on the plateau. Floors are somewhat evenly distributed along the surface of the plateau, with a heavy concentration of red and bentonite floors interspersed with sand and gravel floors. From an open space perspective, a more diverse and segmented pattern is shown. Our analysis shows these floors as they evolve, and you can see some of the floor material shown here in the different maps. And what Vicky and Ann have been able to do is move through these floor identifications and be able to identify where the intense human activity has occurred and try to couple this entire landscape and system together. It's quite a remarkable endeavor that they've undertaken. And shown here is the basis for bringing all of this work together, the dynamism, the development, and the population history of the site. With this database, we are starting to explore other tools that can help us express, explore, and communicate the size and complexity of the site. Our analysis investigates just how the distribution of floors reflects the distribution of architecture and open space. To extend this work, we initiated a project that physically modeled these data using well-tested and more modern design tools. The idea to use these design tools, primarily model building and 3D printing, evolved at a topographic project working with an environmental artist, Stacy Levy. And shown here is how we took the original site model and started to deconstruct it into physical form. And I'll be able to show you how we started to print the site of San Lorenzo. The first step was acquiring equally sized pieces of board that were glued together and put inside of a kiln to dry so that we could cut the model into 4 key pieces. Once these pieces are assembled, we were then able to cut each of the 4 tiles into a scaled version of the site topography, both vertical and horizontal. Using a CNC router located at the Stuckman School of Architecture at Penn State, we intricately started to carve away the topographic perspective of the site. Shown here are some of the details of that CNC routing work. And in the bottom corner, you can see how the model came together. The model was then sanded. Any issues with the topography that weren't printed out were fixed and glued back together. And for each time period, our intent or our design intent is to model each of the major periods of the site. Currently, we are exploring multiple new ways of enhancing this database, perhaps broadening its regional catchment by investigating regional LiDAR and site-based LiDAR, standard multispectral remote sensing and classification, and using drones for landscape feature identification, should we be able to travel after the COVID situation. But what's most important about this new publication is it's the culmination of over, 15 years ago. Honoring the standards, the original San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan archaeological project, we embarked on an innovative approach to study, interpret, and understand the complex coupled natural and human transformations of the Olmec city of San Lorenzo on a very broad scale. Leveraging decades of research and excavations, we gridded this and sampled the unknown, relying heavily on the known. This project was based firmly in the traditional archaeological practice, but sought new ways to more fully capture, archive, and interpret the layered history of this critically important Olmec site. Through this project, and now through this beautiful publication, we can start to re-examine the spatial and temporal patterns of architecture and artifacts in this globally important landscape, as it relates to San Lorenzo's cultural history, but also as it relates to our own anthropological history and inquiry. Thanks for this wonderful opportunity to join you this evening. I am so excited about this new publication and the work that Vicki and Ann have brought together in this beautiful and important archaeological manuscript. Thank you very much.